Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Katie stood firm in the doorway, unfit to move or indeed breathe as Finn's quiet but ruinous words echoed through the living room, the kind of words that didn't just change a moment but rewrote entire continuances, because what he was revealing wasn't gossip or dubitation. Or one further recycled Forrester reproach, it was a deadly secret buried deep in the family's history, a secret connected to Brooke in a way that incontinently shattered everything she believed about herself, her loves, her offerings, and indeed her identity. And as Finn spoke, precisely at first and also with the impregnable force of verity eventually unleashed, Katie watched the color drain from Brooke's face, watched her confident posture deteriorate as decades of precisely constructed recollections began to crack under the weight of what Finn had discovered, because this secret wasn't just about treason or infidelity or commercial deception, it was about life and death, about a tragedy that had been disguised as fate but was actually finagled by Forrester hands that Brooke formerly trusted, loved, and defended with unwavering fidelity. And Finn explained that while reviewing old sanitarium records tied to a long-forgotten accident, one that had always been described as necessary and senseless, he uncovered inconsistencies, autographs altered, timelines acclimated, and medical opinions that no way should have been made, all pointing back to a private intervention ordered by a Forrester primogenitor hopeless to cover the family name at any cost, indeed if that cost was a mortal life. And the worst part, the part that made Katie's knees weak and her heart race, was that Brooke had been there that night, intentionally used as a pawn. Manipulated into signing concurrence forms she no way completely understood, believing she was saving someone when in reality her hand sealed their fate, and Finn's voice quivered as he admitted he'd triple-checked everything, hoping he was wrong, soliciting it was a mistake, but the verity was inarguable. The person who failed wasn't just contributory damage in a Forrester cover-up. It was someone who would laterally turn out to be biologically connected to Brooke, a connection stolen from her before she ever knew it was. And as Finn revealed that the accident victim was Brooke's child, taken from her at birth, declared stillborn, intimately placed into a dangerous situation times laterally to manipulate Brooke emotionally, only to be silenced permanently when the verity hovered to surface, Brooke let out a sound that was less a laugh and further a soul-tearing piecemeal, collapsing onto the settee as decades of pain, guilt, and unanswered questions suddenly made horrifying sense, recollections submerging back of moments when she felt commodity was missing, when grief struck her without explanation, when her bond with her children felt shadowed by an unnoticeable absence, and Katie could slightly reuse it, slightly attune the family she knew with the woman now blubbing uncontrollably, brooding that it couldn't be true, that Ridge would no way allow it, that Eric would no way permission commodity so monstrous. But Finn didn't blench as he explained that Ridge hadn't known at first, that this secret anteceded him, but once the verity surfaced times laterally, the Forrester machine had formerly closed species, choosing silence over justice, character over humanity, and Brooke over the verity, believing that sparing her the pain was an act of love. When in reality it burgled her of the chance to mourn, to know, to fight, to save her child. And Katie felt her own heart shatter as she realized how numerous times she had defended the Forresters, how numerous times she had criticized Brooke for chaos that was no way truly her fault, and now this disclosure recontextualized everything: Brooke's hopeless need for love, her fear of abandonment, her grim pursuit of honesty indeed when it bring her connections, because nearly deep inside she had always tasted a taradiddle so massive it shaped her entire life. And Finn continued, explaining that the recent pitfalls, the mysterious ails, the strange accidents that had girdled Brooke weren't concurrence but the final hopeless moves of someone still guarding the secret, someone willing to destroy Brooke emotionally, spiritually, indeed physically, to ensure the verity no way came out. And when Katie asked who, Finn's silence said everything before he eventually admitted that the orders were traced back to a living Forrester, someone still important, still admired, someone who smiled at family feasts while guarding a crime that had claimed an innocent life. And Brooke's world didn't just break in that moment, it disintegrated, because every love story, every marriage, every treason suddenly blanched in comparison to the consummation that the family she had offered everything for had stolen everything that truly signified. And she rumored that she had defended them, fought for them, lost sisters and daughters and quality for them, and they had repaid her by playing God with her child's life. And Katie, speechless and shaking, understood that nothing would ever be the same again, because this wasn't a secret that could be forgiven with time or healed with love. It was a crack that cut through generations, one that would demand consequences, expose alliances, and force every character to choose between blood fidelity and moral verity. And as Finn finished, his voice heavy with guilt for being the one to bring this desolation into the open, Brooke looked up with a clarity born of absolute loss, declaring that she'd no longer cover the Forrester name, no longer carry their sins on her back, and that if they allowed destroying her world would keep them safe. They were wrong, because the Verity was eventually free, and it would burn everything in its path, leaving Katie standing there, unfit to speak, knowing she had just witnessed the moment when Brooke Logan stopped being the Forrester family's guard and came their topmost reckoning. Brooke's hands quivered as she gripped the arm of the settee, the familiar leather now cold and alien beneath her fritters, and every word Finn had spoken replayed in her mind like a grim, cruel echo, each syllable a hammer striking against the fragile walls of her reality, dismembering every memory she allowed was hers and replacing it with the agony constructed by dishonesty and ambition. And Katie, still frozen beside her, could slightly breathe, slightly comprehend the magnitude of the secret, because it wasn't just about Brooke presently, it was about everyone she loved, everyone she had trusted, everyone whose lives were inextricably entwined with the Forresters and now irreversibly stained by the sins of the history. And as Finn detailed how the layers of the conspiracy unfolded over decades, how each Forrester who had touched the sanitarium records, each superintendent who had inked off on the falsified documents, each family member who had turned a eyeless eye, had contributed to a heritage of manipulation that extended beyond business to the veritably core of their humanity. Katie felt nausea rise in her throat, knowing that her family's conglomerate of silk and incense was erected on secrets darker than anyone had ever dared imagine, and Brooke, still trying to gather herself, rumored, nearly softly, that she had always tasted a shadow lurking behind the grins, the charity festivals, the commercial triumphs, the lavish parties, and now the pieces fell into a horrifying mystification, a mystification where she realized she had been a pawn, a party in her own tragedy without ever knowing it. And Finn's voice cracked as he reported how he'd uncovered forensic substantiation, testaments from nurses long retired, hidden sanitarium lines, photos of the invigorated taken the night the child was declared dead, documents showing deliberate loss and falsification of medical procedures, all pointing to one inarguable verity that Brooke's child had been taken from her under the guise of protection, placed into circumstances that could have led to endless detriment, and left in the murk so that the Forrester name would remain untarnished, a verity so toxic that it made the air around them feel thick and nearly unbreathable. And Katie, who had always flattered herself on knowing the Forresters outside and out, felt a creeping terror at the consummation that the family she had devoted her life to defending was able of similar inenumerable acts that transcended contest, business colluding, or indeed particular treason. They were acts of deliberate, advised destruction, cloaked in concern and family fidelity but fueled by the raw, cold desire to control, to manipulate, to abolish any trouble to their public image. And as Finn moved to show Brooke the substantiation he'd collected, the photos, the autographs, the recorded accounts, Brooke's knees buckled beneath her, and she gripped at the documents as if they were both a lifeline and a dagger aimed at her heart, because each piece verified what she had always stressed in the quietest corners of her mind, that the life she had erected, the children she had raised, the love she had lost and gained, were all undercut by a crime so profound that it shattered her identity at its foundation. And Katie, trying to base herself in the chaos, reached out to Brooke, but her hand floated in the air, doubtful whether to console or to brace herself for the fallout, and Finn, now more bent than ever, explained that uncovering the verity was only the morning, because once it was known, the Forresters would reply, some with denial, some with fury, some with calculated attempts to rewrite history again, and Brooke, gashes streaming down her face, rumored that she didn't want to hear any further names, any further details, that each disclosure felt like another weight added to her casket, a weight that hovered to crush her fully. But Finn persisted, because she merited the verity no matter how painful. And as he continued to unravel the timeline, the names of those involved, and the cover-ups orchestrated to help discovery, Brooke began to fluctuate not only from grief but from a growing fire of righteous wrathfulness, the kind of wrathfulness that didn't just poach but demanded justice, demanded responsibility. And Katie, watching the metamorphosis, realized that Brooke Logan, who had spent decades navigating backstabbings and dishonors, was now facing the treason of all backstabbings, one that readdressed her very actuality and forced her to review every relationship, every fidelity, every choice she had ever made. And the room sounded to shrink around them as the reality set in that the Forrester conglomerate, which had always sounded untouchable, was suddenly a house of cards erected atop falsehoods and lives stolen, and Finn, seeing Brooke's expression harden with the first flicker of determination, knew that the disclosure would spark a storm so important that no one would remain untouched, because Brooke was no longer the woman who could still endure reproach, no longer the woman who would accept deception for the sake of peace, no longer the woman who would allow the sins of the history to remain retired while innocent lives suffered. And as he finished speaking, he let the silence stretch, heavy and stifling, knowing that the emotional eruption would resonate far beyond this room, beyond Los Angeles, beyond anyone who had been connected to the Forresters, and Brooke, eventually raising her head, looked at Katie with eyes burning with a admixture of grief, rage, and clarity, and she said, her voice low but pulsing, that the Forrester family had stolen her child, had manipulated her entire life, had used love as an armament against her, and that now it was time to reclaim the verity, to defy every conspirator, to unearth every hidden fact, and Katie, realizing the enormity of what Brooke was declaring, felt the magnitude of what they were about to unleash, a reckoning so violent that it would shatter connections, reports, and maybe indeed lives, because the verity, formerly exposed, couldn't be contained, and as Brooke sluggishly rose from the settee, she looked at Finn with a blend of gratefulness and determination, admitting that his courage in revealing the secret, while ruinous, had given her the power to act, and as they both turned toward the broader counter-accusations, the house sounded to joggle with pressure, as if apprehensive of the storm gathering, the storm that would sweep through the Forrester manse, the services, the families, and the veritably foundations of trust, because when Brooke Logan chose to fight for her child, for her misplaced times, for justice, the world she had known would no longer live, and Katie, still floundering to find words, realized that the chapter they were entering would not just be about vengeance or exposure but about reclaiming stolen lives, reconsidering patrimonies, and defying the darkest trueness of the Forrester name. And as Brooke began to speak, outlining the way she'd take, from legal action to particular battle, from uncovering the full network of conspirators to icing that the stolen child's identity and safety were restored, Katie realized that she was witnessing a metamorphosis, the birth of a Brooke who would no longer bow to sweat, who would no longer allow silence to mandate her fate, a Brooke whose every action would shoot shockwaves through the lives of everyone who had ever allowed they could control or deceive her. And Finn, watching this resoluteness solidify, felt an admixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that while the verity had been revealed, the path forward was fraught with pitfall, battle, and heartache, and that in exposing the Forrester family's deadliest secret, they had opened a door that could no way be closed, a door behind which lay consequences that would ever alter alliances, test commitment, and review what it meant to be a Forrester, a Logan, or indeed a friend or adversary. And as Brooke eventually addressed the full compass of the treason, naming names, relating histories, challenging the falsehoods, and preparing to reclaim what was stolen, Katie, speechless yet completely apprehensive of the seismic shift in the air, understood that this moment wasn't just a disclosure, not just a reproach, not just another cleaner pieces twist, but a abecedarian turning point, the kind of moment that changed fates, rewritten patrimonies, and forced everyone in its route to defy their own conspiracy, morality, and courage, because Brooke Logan, standing amid gashes, fury, and verity, was no longer the victim of circumstance but the author of reckoning, and the Forrester conglomerate, for all its wealth, influence, and power, would no way be the same again. And as the sun set outdoors, casting long murk over the manse, Katie realized that silence had been shattered, secrets had been exhumed, and a storm was coming, impregnable, ineluctable, and fated to reshape every life it touched. The weight of Brooke's disclosure hung in the manse like a storm pall, thick, suffocating, charged with electricity, and Katie, still reeling, could feel it pressing against her casket, each breath a memorial that nothing in their lives would ever be the same again, because the secret Finn had uncovered was further than a reproach, further than a treason, Further than a tragedy, it was a seismic fracture in the foundation of the Forrester conglomerate, a fracture that hovered to expose long-buried sins, unravel precisely maintained facades, and force every family member, every supporter, every rival to defy the reality that their conduct, their silence, their conspiracy, had contributed to the destruction of an innocent life. And as Brooke began to pace, her mind racing, her heart pounding, her feelings an unpredictable blend of grief, rage, and determination, she realized that the moment needed a strategy, a plan, not just to reclaim what was stolen but to ensure that justice was served and that the verity, formerly unleashed, would not be silenced again. And Katie, watching her family transfigure from shattered to bent, felt a blend of admiration and fear, knowing that Brooke's wrath, when combined with her grim pursuit of verity, could bring down conglomerates, destroy reports, and review power within the family and beyond. And Finn, standing hard, felt the enormity of what he'd set in stir, knowing that revealing the secret was just the morning, that the fallout would ripple through every corner of Los Angeles, affecting marriages, Gemütlichkeit, alliances, and business deals, because the Forrester family, for all its glamour, wealth, and influence, had erected its conglomerate on secrets, falsehoods, and the careful manipulation of everyone around them. And now those secrets were exposed, and nothing would ever be the same. And as Brooke's fury burned, she began to suppose of everyone who had been complicit, everyone who had known or suspected and chosen silence over action, and the list was long, each name a target for battle, responsibility, and in some cases, vengeance. And Katie, realizing the compass of what was coming, could feel a bite run down her chine, because while they had uncovered the verity had a power of its own, a power that demanded response, demanded action, demanded consequences. And Brooke, pacing with adding intensity, began to outline a plan, starting with Ridge, who she knew had to understand the graveness of the situation, the depth of the treason, the stakes involved, because Ridge had always been a protection, a strategist, someone who could anticipate the moves of adversaries and abettors likewise, and she demanded his support, not just emotionally but strategically, to navigate the unfaithful waters that lay ahead. And as she rehearsed her words, imagining the battle with Ridge, the discussion that would determine whether he'd stand with her or against her, Katie felt the pressure in the room escalate, the air thick with expectation, dread, and the electric charge of ineluctable conflict. And Finn, seeing the storm structure, realized that while he'd delivered the verity, he couldn't control the consequences, couldn't shield Brooke from the emotional and political fallout, could only stand as a substantiation and supporter, and a party in a drama that would gulf everyone. And as Brooke's plan began to take shape, she considered every angle, every implicit response, every possible handicap, knowing that the Forrester family had a history of ruthless protection of their own, of silencing pitfalls, of manipulating narratives, and she had to be prepared for every deception, every taradiddle, every treason that might be used against her. Because once the secret of her child's exposure and the deliberate falsification of records came public, there would be no going back, no retreat, no possibility of ignoring the consequences. And Katie, floundering to reuse the enormity of it all, could see the shift in Brooke, the transition from victim to force of reckoning, from grieving mama to strategist, from shattered family to chastiser. And she realized that what Finn had unleashed wasn't just a disclosure but the morning of a war fought not with munitions but with verity, battle, and the implacable pursuit of justice. And Brooke, now sitting at the edge of the grand staircase, her hands gripping the rail, began to suppose of the first battle, the meeting that would set the tone for everything that followed. And she knew it had to be with Eric, the primogenitor whose opinions, silence, and conspiracy had allowed the crime to persist, whose protection of the family name had come at the expenditure of lives. And as she imagined Eric's face, the stern, composed mask he always wore, she felt a admixture of wrathfulness, fear,